Well, hello, my friend. I want to make sure you're tracking the Intentional Leader Lab, which kicks off the first week of October. This is a 6-month curated leadership experience for top leaders who want to continue to grow. Or if you're a leader who've had success at work, but you want to make sure you also have success at home. Over the past week, I had 3 top leaders sign up: a retired 3-star general who used to lead an organization with over 4,500 people, a top leader in a real estate firm out in Dallas, and a Army Ranger who's now an attorney at a top DC firm. This is the quality of leaders that you would be working with if you joined the Intentional Leader Lab. I've only got 9 spots left, and we'll be launching the first week of October. So go and click on the link below if you want to book a call with me to see if it's a good fit. It'll be a 6-month experience walking through the Narrow Path framework, where we look at your vision, your values, your mindsets, your relationships, your calendars, your priorities, your energy, and then your purpose for leading. On the other side of this 6-month journey is more impact, more influence, and more joy. I would love to have you when we kick this off the first week of October. You can email me at cal@calwalters.me, or just click the link below and apply or book a call with me to see if it's a good fit. Now let's jump into the episode. Well, hello, my friend. Welcome back to the Intentional Leader Podcast. I'm really excited to welcome Dr. Ryan Gottfredson back to the show for his 3rd appearance. We go really deep on this episode. We talk about trauma. We talk about vertical development. We talk about your being versus your doing. This is a powerful conversation, and this is exactly the type of work that we're going to be doing in the Intentional Leader Lab. We're not just looking at surface level transformation. We're looking at deep, intentional transformation that can only happen in community. So it's a pleasure to have Dr. Gottfredson back on the podcast. I encourage you to check out his new book, Becoming Better, which will have links to that in the show notes of this episode. So without any further ado, please enjoy my conversation with Dr. Gottfredson. All right. Well, it is so exciting to have Ryan Gottfredson back on the podcast. This is round 3, Ryan. So thanks for doing this.
Awesome. Well, man, I must have done something right before, I guess. I don't know.
You have a very unique lens of looking at leadership. It's always really fresh. And I was telling you before we hopped on that we just finished where I work, where I teach leadership. We just finished going through your first book, I think it was, Success Mindsets, in an elective. So your material is fresh in my brain. And it's amazing that 5 years after writing that book, it is still so relevant for leaders. So I'm excited that you're coming out with a new book, Becoming Better, the groundbreaking science of personal transformation. Where does this book fit with your other 2 books?
Yeah, great questions. In fact, if I could go back in time and know what I know now, I would have written all of these books in the opposite order. Because what happened was with Success Mindsets was I knew a lot about mindsets, and I wanted to get that out into the world, but I would say I didn't have the depth around mindsets. You see, I was starting to promote these ideas of mindsets to organizations that I worked with, and I said, I could help your leaders develop through a focus on their mindsets. And that resonated with only the groups of people that already valued mindsets. And when I was doing this mindset work, I realized that this type of development that I'm doing is actually different than traditional development. But I didn't really have a language to explain how it was different and unique. And then I came across the terminology of vertical development and horizontal development. And that's what my second book focuses on. So that's the elevated leader. And what I talk about in that book is how most development is horizontal development, and that improves our talent, knowledge, skills, and abilities. But there's another form of development that's vertical development, and that is something that generally isn't focused on, but when we do it is really transformational. And mindsets is a big part of that vertical development. So that's the elevated leader. And now this new book is really, I think, bringing those ideas forward in a more easily digestible way. And the audience has changed. It's now not just for leaders, it's for everybody or anybody who wants to take a massive and transformational step upward in their lives and living life at a higher altitude. Because what I've learned, and you can feel free to push back on me, Cal, if you feel differently, but I feel like I've learned that most people do not know how to transformationally improve themselves. Mm-hmm. And that's the primary purpose of this new book, Becoming Better.
Mm. Yeah, it kind of answers a question that I've asked a lot of, just how do we actually change? And there are a lot of frameworks for that. There are a lot of ways to think about a theory of change. But I think your book really answers that. And I think there is a desire among people that listen to this show to improve, to get better. And then the question is, okay, well, how do you do that? And so if you're a listener right now listening to this, I hope that at the end of this conversation, you will have more clarity about how do you actually improve? What would be the playbook if you were going to change or if you were going to help someone else transform over time? One question real quick on mindsets, Ryan. Have you seen people become more open to that over time? Because I see a lot of people talking about mental models is something that I'm seeing a lot of discussion around. I see Carol Dweck's work more and more. She's the one who, wrote Mindset and talked a lot about growth versus fixed. But I'm just curious, have you seen people become more receptive to that? And if so, why do you think that is?
Yeah, great question. I'm not sure I actually have seen people become any more receptive, and I just wish we would. I think there's a couple of
You would
challenges.
know.
I think one of the challenges is that mindsets has become a bit of a buzzword, and we could kind of put a mindset to anything. Like, oh, you have a leadership mindset, you have an entrepreneurial mindset, you have a money mindset. And while that's well intended, I think it actually does the field of mindsets a disservice. Because if we really understand what mindsets are mental lenses that we wear that are intimately connected and primarily involved in our nervous system and how our brain actually processes information. And there are specific sets of mindsets that exist, that are out there that we can put labels to. And that's what my book, Success Mindsets, does. And each of these mindset sets, which here's something that's unique about these, is these mindset sets, such as fixed and growth mindsets, they actually all revolve around a self-protective fear. And that, when we start talking about our self-protective fears, we now start to go really deep within ourselves, right? So a fixed and growth mindset, for example, the self-protective fear that we may have if we have a fixed mindset is we have the fear of looking bad and of failing. And that's justifiable, right? Who likes to fail? But if we could create the space and the tolerance for failure, it actually helps us to become better. And that's that's part of the journey is, as I think we know how to transformationally become better. We know how to incrementally become better because we know how to learn new things and we know how to develop skills. But by focusing on knowledge generation and skill development is not enough for transformational change. We need to focus on something different. So in fact, if it's okay, Cal, let me give a quick example that might bring this to life. Yeah. So I received a phone call from one of my clients, and he said, I've got a woman on my team, and this is kind of the last resort for her. I can't help her develop, but she is kind of stuck. She has been in this position for a decade, and I've either got to move her up or I've got to move her out, and it would break my heart to move her out. And so he said, can you work with her? I said, yeah, well, let me give it a shot. And so he introduces us via email, and I get this email back from her, and at the bottom of her email is a number of letters signifying different degrees that she has, and there's a variety of professional certificates down in her email signature. And I'm thinking, man, this woman has been through a lot of development efforts, a lot of development programs. And so I'm wondering, why does she need so much development? Why is her boss so concerned about her? And so I got on a phone with her, and it was like heartbreaking to hear her story. She talked about how every year she gets passed up for promotion. And so she goes and gets a new degree or a new certificate. And she's like at her wit's end because she feels like she is so stuck in this position and there's nothing. And she's kind of telling me, I'm doing everything that I can to get promoted, and I am unable to get promoted. And so as we dug into this, as I started working with her, what I came to realize is that she is incredibly smart. She has a lot of skills. And therefore it made sense that she's frustrated. But what I learned is that she is a very insecure person. She had a lot of fear about misstepping. And so the reason why she had been hung up over the last 10 years was because her body's nervous system almost prevented her from taking initiative. So she was great when she was told what to do, but they didn't trust her to step into a leadership role because she struggled taking initiative because she had some self-protective fears that were holding her back, that were connected to a fixed mindset, also in this case, a prevention mindset. And what I've found is that this type of a dynamic is not uncommon. I mean, I think all of us, to a certain degree, we have our own blocks, our own hurdles, and most of us are just not aware of what they are, and therefore we can't really do anything about it. And so that's part of what I think we can do by focusing on mindsets and related topics, is we could help people deepen their self-awareness and actually help them to improve themselves in transformational ways, as opposed to, I'm going to say, somewhat of these surface Band-Aid level fixes.
Did you see any improvement in her as you started to work on some of the mindset work?
Well, and that's the cool thing about this, is it is so eye-opening for people when they go through this process and they come to see, oh my goodness, how I've been operating, it makes sense to me, but I haven't fully appreciated how it was holding me back. And so just the light bulb of awareness was one thing, and that's awesome. But then what we then get to see is, after this awareness occurs, then inevitably if we want to improve, we've got to start stretching ourselves. And that's where courage exists. When we start stretching ourselves, start pushing ourselves. So she had to start taking initiative. Now, I didn't tell her to start with this big, great, grand thing, but we start with little things. And little things, over time, she starts to build up this confidence. And then she becomes this, like I want to say, independent woman, but it's more than that. It's this empowered woman who now can step forward confidently as a leader, whereas before was so insecure in her ability to do that.
It's fascinating. And I want to get into this really powerful framework that you have of really this doing side versus the being. But just, I'm curious, as we're talking about this, do you think people think that their thinking is good? Is there a hesitation to challenge our own thinking, especially in people who have already experienced some level of success? I mean, even this lady has experienced success to a certain, I mean, she's got all these degrees. So the idea that if a guy like Ryan Gottfredson comes in and says, hey, let's talk about our thinking, I just feel like there might be this defensiveness that comes inside of us of like, what do you mean my thinking? I've lived with my thinking as long as I've been alive, and it's done okay. So I wonder if you see that in people, where they push back on, one, it's too fuzzy. Like, I can't really, these skills over here, that's something I can see. Okay, I can go get a degree, and then I put it beside my name and my email. It makes me feel good that I really added a skill to my kit bag. But the thinking, it seems vague and obscure, and it also seems like I've gotten this far. Why do I really need to work on that?
I never get any resistance to talking about mindsets. Never at all. No. And that's the reality, is almost every single time I talk about mindsets, there's resistance. It pops up within us because we identify so strongly with how we think. Well, how do we come to think the way that we do? Well, it's largely two things that shapes our mindsets: our life's experience and our current culture. And those come to shape how we see our world. And one of the things that I've learned, and unfortunately, this is the reality. So let me throw out some statistics here. 70%, it's estimated that at least 70% of people have experienced significant trauma in their lives. Well, the more trauma one experiences in their lives, do you think that they become more self-protecting or more value creating? Well, naturally, if we experience trauma, we're going to become more self-protecting. And that's our body's natural default defense mechanism against trauma. And so if we've been hurt in the past, of course we're going to struggle to trust others, for example. And so when we don't trust others, that feels right. That feels good to us because we have been burned before. And so we could justify our thinking, but ultimately if we don't trust others, then that's holding us back from living and operating in the way that we would ideally like to live and operate. I mean, the degree to which we are able and willing to trust others shapes every single relationship that we have. And so if we are somebody who's been hurt before and that limits our trust, well, yeah, that's protecting me and that's going to feel good to me, but that doesn't necessarily make it ideal or optimal.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. And I think about my own leadership. My worst moments, Ryan, as a leader were when I was operating out of a deep place of insecurity. I was maybe new to the job and I just felt this imposter syndrome. And I then felt like, oh, I need to prove myself. I need to do something to make it clear that I know what I'm doing, which was really a fixed mindset. And these mindsets, and we'll get into them more, but for those listening or watching, I mean, this is really the way the way you approach challenges. That's your thinking. The way you approach new information, that's your thinking. Those are your mindsets. The way you approach risk gets to your thinking. The way you approach your openness to others, also your thinking. And the cool thing about your first book, and you cover it in this book as well, is you give us a framework for each of those core areas. And I think about those things with leaders. How do you approach challenges? We need a playbook for that. How do you approach risk? You need a playbook for that. How do you approach new information? And so I just think you're really tapping into something really important. And this book is a powerful addition to it. So tell us, I love this line in your book. You said, this book is not about doing better. It's about becoming better. And you lay out this framework of the doing side and the being side. So tell us what those two concepts are.
Yeah. And maybe even to get into this, let me put you on the spot, Cal. I'm gonna list off some people. You tell me what these people seem to have in common, okay?
Okay.
So if you recognize them, we got Bobby Knight, who's former head coach at Indiana University. That's my alma mater. Michael Jackson, Tiger Woods, Bill Clinton, Ellen DeGeneres. I'm trying to think if there's any others. We'll go with those. What do those people seem to have in common?
Ooh, I mean, they're all famous.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think of what those people have in common. Well, when you said Bobby Knight, and I'm trying to connect, like Bobby Knight was fired, Ellen DeGeneres fired. Who were the other people you said?
Bill Clinton, Tiger Woods, Michael Jackson.
They all had some form of a scandal. I don't know if that's what you're getting at.
No,
okay.
That's part of what I'm getting at, right? So
okay.
I want to get on two things, and you kind of touched on both of them. So one is these are incredibly successful individuals, or have been. Mm-hmm. In fact, they've been at the top, the pinnacle of their professions. And that's awesome. But each of them also has kind of controversy surrounding it.
Yeah.
And when we step into this, it helps us to recognize that there are actually two different parts of ourselves. As you alluded to, one part is our doing side. That's our talent, knowledge, skills, and abilities. And that's what these individuals had in spades. That's what's helped them to become successful and to become famous. But it's not their doing side that got them into trouble, if you will. Mm-hmm. It's their being side. Now, the being side is the degree or the quality of our body's internal operating system. So people who are lower on their being side altitude, they are more reactive. And people who are higher on their being side altitude, they are much more thoughtful and intentional, mindful and present. So those are some of the characteristics that we could see. And so what we could see with these individuals is that they all misstepped at times, not because of their talent, knowledge, skills, and abilities, but because their body was wired to cause them to self-protect in some way, as opposed to value create. Mm. And so each of us, we have a being side. Whether we're in touch with it or not, we have a being side. And so what my book does is designed to help introduce people to what is my being side, How do I gauge my altitude along my being side? What's my quality of my being side? And then how do I elevate my being side? And what I've learned is that when we improve along our doing side, which is great, we should improve along our doing side, that is only incrementally helpful at best. But when we elevate along our being side, that is transformational, right? When we look at anybody who is radically changed and elevated their lives, what we're going to find is being side development is at the core of that transformation.
That's so interesting because you do see that a lot where someone's skills and their competence, they outpace. The word that I often use is character. And it seems like you are talking about character, but maybe going beyond that idea as well, or maybe even just giving some language around what we often would just generally refer to as character. And feel free to push back on that.
No, I totally agree. In fact, I'll add to that is I will commonly talk about our being side as the quality of our character. Okay. And I think so often we think about character as, do I do what I'm going to say, what I say I'm going to do type thing? Do I live with integrity? And I actually, as I've come to understand this perspective, I guess I've always seen myself as somebody of high character. Mm-hmm. But the more I've learned about my being side and what it is, the more I realize I've got a decent amount of self-protective wiring built within my body that is suggestive that my character level may not be as high as I once thought. And the reality of this is all of us have some self-protective programming. But what I've also learned is that most of us aren't necessarily aware of that. And that's one of the inherent challenges about this. But I mean, the reality is we are taught nothing about our being side in our education, our upbringing, anything. And so if we've never been taught about it, why would we ever focus on it? And we don't. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the reasons why we see who gets promoted in organizations. Well, it's the people that have the best doing sides, the people who could get certain stuff done. And so that's great. We promote people who have great doing sides, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they have a great being side. Mm. And that's where most leaders misstep is they're incredibly talented people along the doing side, but you get people like Bobby Knight who, because they get angry at a ref, they throw a chair across the court, right? And mm-hmm. that's what they become famous for. Not the national championships that he won, but because he threw a chair across the court because he struggled to regulate his emotions in a heated situation. Yeah. And that is more indicative of the quality of our being side than almost anything else.
It's so true. And when something like that happens, we wonder, how did that happen? How did that possibly? And it's like at that moment, their character just leaks out of them. And you're right. We do conflate this idea of skill development with you must have all the other developments. I almost think about it like, how Patrick Lencioni's framework for organizations of smart and healthy, it's mm-hmm. almost in some ways that paradigm, but for a person, we tend to focus on the smart skills of, hey, develop these things for your organization that you can quantify, it's attractive, but we neglect the healthy part of it, the culture part of it, or our own kind of personal development, our being side. And then we wonder, but then we start to see the manifestation of that. And then at that point, it's almost too late of like, ooh, I don't like that ugliness inside of me. So let's say you've got someone listening or watching and they're like, okay, Ryan, I'm all in. I love this concept. I want to focus on my being side, but I need a little more of a practical understanding of what do I go do to improve my being side?
Yeah, well, one, it all starts with awareness. So we've got to start to awaken to the quality of our being side. And so here's some ways in which we could start that process. So one is to consider the concept of window of tolerance. Are you familiar with this concept, Cal?
No.
Which I'm surprised how I just feel like in the psychology world, everybody's familiar with it. But if we're not in that space, we're not familiar. So the idea of the window of tolerance, and this is connected to our nervous system, is that there is a span in which we can operate when we are in our zone of cognitive and emotional control. So, right, if there's no stress going on, we're sitting right in the zone of this cognitive and emotional control. But as stress and pressure pop up, we start to move towards the edges of what's called our window of tolerance. As we move towards the edges of our window of tolerance, we start to lose our cognitive and emotional control. And in fact, when we go outside of these edges, we lose our cognitive and emotional control altogether. Right? This is when people gets in fits of rage. You get cut off on the freeway. I got the double bird the other day. I didn't even cut anybody off on the freeway. I got the double bird. I don't know what I did, but I'm not sure somebody flips the double bird from within their window of tolerance.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that I think we could all recognize is that people differ in the width of their window of tolerance. Some people are much more easily triggered than others. And so one of the ways to kind of connect to our being side altitude is to investigate, what's my window of tolerance? How much does it take for me to start to lose control of my cognitions and emotions? What are the circumstances in which that occurs the most? And so when we start to feel into our window of tolerance, that's one way to start to investigate our altitude along our being side. I'll give you another example here just a second, one we've talked about already, but let me pause there and see if you have anything to add on window of tolerance.
Oh man, I have so many questions, but my first question is, can we expand our window of tolerance?
Yes, for sure. And that's one of the cool things about this, right? And I used to be somebody 10 years ago, if you would have asked me, do you meditate? I would have been, no, why would I ever meditate? Like I'm a religious person. I don't need to meditate, right? Was kind of my way of thinking. But what we've come to learn through the science of meditation is one of the best exercises we can engage in to expand our window of tolerance. All right. As we meditate, we are working on improving and adapting our body's nervous system so that we could stay more calm, cool, and collected when it hits the fan. Right? That's innately, that's the core fundamental purpose of meditation. And that's one of the most valuable exercises we can do to expand our window of tolerance.
Yeah, go on to the next thing you were going to say. And then I have a few other questions that are coming into my mind. And part of it is because I teach emotional intelligence. So I'm just kind of wondering if there's a connection to some of this stuff. But you had something else you wanted to share.
Yeah, and I want to get to the emotional intelligence. There's some cool stuff we could cover there. So the other thing I'm just going to mention is, so I talked about one way to get in touch with our being side is to look at our window of tolerance. Another way that we could connect with our being side is to look at our meaning making. How do we make meaning of our world? Well, our mindsets are our meaning makers. So when we investigate the quality of our mindsets, we're actually investigating our being side altitude. So you brought up some really good examples, right? How do you make meaning of risk? Do you see it as something to avoid? Or is it a necessary step to get from where we are now to where we need to go? Right? How we make meaning of it, right? When we see risk as something to avoid, that is a self-protective strategy. But when we see risk as a necessary part of our journey, we no longer look at it as something to avoid, but something that's inevitably going to occur, and therefore we don't run away from it. We create the space for it. And when we could create the space for risk, when we could create the space for failure, when we could create the space for new and different ideas, that allows us to operate as more of a value creator as opposed to a self-protector. And so when we can investigate how we make meaning of anything. How do we make meaning of love? How do we make meaning of others? How do we make meaning of, our identity? And when we make meaning of things in ways that serve us in terms of protecting us in the short term, that's just an indication that our being side altitude is maybe a little bit lower. There's a few other frameworks and things that we could talk through, but I think that's probably a pretty good place for now. And if people get the book or even go to my website at ryangottfredson.com, there's a couple of self-assessments that are designed to help us to better evaluate the altitude along our being side.
I love how deep you can go on these topics. And I also appreciate that you understand the science behind this. So I have been teaching emotional intelligence, and I start with just telling students about the power of emotional intelligence, how it's this indicator of high performance and high levels of successful leadership. And then we walk through I often walk them through the 4 domains that Goleman talks about, and then also Travis Bradbury. But it starts with self-awareness.
Yep.
This is a part that I'm unclear on, though. I'd love to get your take on this. When I think about increasing your self-awareness, and I often will think about it as kind of internal and external. I think Tasha Eurich, at least that's the article I read that kicked that off in my mind. But when I'm wanting to become more self-aware, I think about my emotions, but then also my thinking. And I'm wondering, should I be viewing those as separate things, or should I be viewing those as connected things? Because, for example, my emotions. So I'm thinking about, okay, the last week, what emotions did I experience? I experienced some sadness, some joy, some happiness, some love. And then, of course, you're trying to get to a point where I can be aware of my emotions, and then I can actually regulate my emotions to make them productive, or to make myself productive. But then there's I kind of think about it separately of like my thinking. Okay, I want to be aware of how am I approaching obstacles? How am I thinking about obstacles? How am I thinking about risks? I'm just wondering, how do you think about that? Am I is it appropriate to think about them as separate things, or are they connected? How do you frame that in your mind?
Yeah, I think it could be helpful to think about it as separate, but also connected. And so here, I'm gonna give you another option. What if we were to think about it in terms of what is my programming?
Okay.
So we can dive into this particular situation. For example, maybe we didn't handle it as well as we could have, for example, and we can investigate, how was my body wired to operate in this particular situation? And one of the ways that we can investigate this is by creating if-then statements. So if X occurs, then I will feel Y, for example. So let me try to think of one off the top of my head. So if I might be wired, if I receive constructive criticism, then I get defensive, right? That's many people's programming.
Yeah.
Well, now we can if we can identify that's my programming, then we can investigate why. Why am I programmed to get defensive when I receive constructive criticism? Well, I'm kind of making meaning of this as an attack. Mm-hmm. And now I get to question, was it really an attack? Right? Or is constructive criticism completely safe and I'm maybe overreacting a little bit in this particular situation? And I'm not, so I now recognize that I'm not creating space to hear the other person. Mm. And that doesn't mean I have to run with their ideas, but my body isn't currently allowing me to create the space to take in and absorb this constructive criticism. And that means that my body in this instance is really self-protective. I'm trying to protect something. So now I get to ask, what am I trying to protect? And this is where we can get really deep, because oftentimes what we're trying to protect is a younger, hurt version of ourselves that we haven't nurtured to the degree that we could have.
Wow. One, not really pushback, but I just want to make sure I understand this. So when you start to talk about programming, I immediately was thinking, oh, well, that feels like I don't have a choice. That feels like, but then you were also kind of describing some level of choice in the moment. So it almost seems like it's both. It's both like we have these certain mindsets that exist. We have our own wiring and programming, and we need to be aware of that. And we need to probably work through that. But then we also have some level of choice. And it seems to me that over time, going back to that window idea, over time, through some level of neuroplasticity or work, that we can become more capable in those moments as well. So it almost seems like there are things that just exist that we need to be aware of, and maybe we can't change the past, but we can affect the future. Yeah. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, so let's dive into the neuroscience on this. That sounds really scary, but I think we can do it in a way that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, please.
So we have three brain networks in our brain that are responsible for us processing and navigating our world. They are called the salience network, the default mode network, and the central executive network. So let me walk you through each of these.
Yeah.
So our body's nervous systems operates in a manner in which our senses are continually sending signals to our brain. Now, we don't take in all of those signals, but we will filter in the signals that we deem most relevant and important for that environment or that context. And when are these signals get into our brain, the first place they go is into our salience network. This is essentially the home of our emotional system. This is our limbic system, the signals go in there for immediate processing. So, for example, I might filter in, okay, I'm receiving constructive criticism. Now, my salience network is going to attach a meaning to that. It might be a meaning of, this is an attack, right? The alarms start going off. And then the salience network determines, do I pass this on to the central executive network, which is our home of conscious thought, or do I pass it on to our default mode network, which is our home of non-conscious operation? And what we know is that 90% of our thinking, feeling, judging, and acting are driven by our non-conscious automatic processing.
Wow.
Literally our internal operating system. This is what I'm calling our internal operating system.
I see.
So it's not like we don't have a choice in the matter, but we do have programming. And our body defaults to natural and embedded programming built up over time because it's a more efficient way for our body to operate. So in these moments, right, when I receive constructive criticism, immediately I might get defensive. And it's not like I had to get defensive, but that's the way my body is programmed to operate. Now, I can disrupt that by activating my central executive network. And I could kind of, in that moment, I can be intentional about, okay, I've got to slow down my non-conscious operation. And now I've got to turn on my central executive network. And I've got to attempt to operate differently than how I'm typically wired to operate. And so again, it's not that we do have the ability to alter our actions in any given moment. And that's what I love about like Viktor Frankl's work. No matter what happens to me, I still have a choice. But what we've also got to recognize is we have a whole lot of embedded internal operating system wiring that we largely aren't aware of. And we just kind of do what's default to us. Does that make sense?
Oh, that's so helpful, man. I love that. And which of those is the prefrontal cortex part of the?
Yeah, so the salience network is largely the limbic system. The central executive network is like the top side of our prefrontal cortex, and that's our conscious thought. And then our default mode network is kind of a deeper layer, and also to the sides of our prefrontal cortex. So they are in different locations, and we just activate them differently depending upon kind of how our salience network interprets our environment.
That's so fascinating.
Well, let me blow your mind if that's okay. Can I take it a step further?
Yeah, keep it going. Yeah, take it further.
Because we started with emotional intelligence, okay?
Yeah.
So get this. So you reference the 4 different aspects of emotional intelligence. So there's self-awareness and self-management, and there's other awareness, and effectively, how do we navigate the emotions of others? Yeah. So those are the 4 kind of quadrants of emotional intelligence. And here's one of my pet peeves about emotional intelligence. Most people who try to help people develop an emotional intelligence, they see emotional intelligence as a doing side ability or skill. Yeah. And it's not. It's almost completely a being side ability. So let me explain why this is. So, and I got into this by learning about the impact that trauma has on our nervous system. So what we find is that when we experience trauma, it generally results in one of 2 neurological adaptations within our brain. So one of those adaptations, one of the common adaptations, is that the salience network becomes overactive and the default mode network can't step in and regulate that salience network. What this is called hypervigilance. So a lot of people, when they've experienced trauma, for example, maybe they've been abused in some way, well, now they are more hypervigilant to any situation where there's an indication they might get hurt. And so what we could say, somebody who's been abused as a child, let's just say I give them constructive criticism now as an adult, well, they might want to start to fight me. Like I didn't attack them in any way. I didn't threaten them in any way, but their body's now hypervigilant for that. And you probably know much more about this than I do, being in a military context and knowing some of the impacts that some of our veterans face as a result of the trauma that they've experienced. But that's one of these neural adaptations. Our salience network becomes it becomes overstimulated or more easily stimulated, and our default mode network can't step in and say, hey, look, that sound that you heard, that was a car backfiring and not a gunshot. You're okay, right? The default mode network may not step in and help with that. And so when we are hypervigilant, we have, when it comes to those emotional intelligence quadrants, we are so concerned about our emotions that we aren't able to connect with the emotions of others.
Yeah.
And we aren't able to regulate our emotions. So when we are wired more for hypervigilant, that's actually diminishing our emotional intelligence. So that's one of these adaptations. The other adaptations is what's called dissociation. Dissociation is the opposite effect within our brain. It's when our default mode network overregulates our salience network and shuts off all emotions. And we become dissociated. And so when we become dissociated, when it comes to emotional intelligence, we can't connect with our own emotions. And if we can't connect with our own emotions, how good of a job do you think we're going to do at being able to navigate others' emotions? Not very good at all.
Wow.
So what this, I'll summarize and I'll get your thoughts on this. But what we've learned is that trauma is one of the primary factors that negatively impacts our being side altitude. And because it disrupts how these three brain regions function and operate. And when we are more dissociated or we're more hypervigilant, that's an indication that we're lower on our being side, that we're not as emotionally intelligent as we could be. And the only way for us to elevate along our being side and to elevate our emotional intelligence is to actually heal our body's nervous system. And that's the work of, ultimately, that's the work of vertical development or improving along the being side. It's all about healing our body's internal operating system. And when we could do that, then we could operate at higher levels of cognitive and emotional sophistication. So I just dumped a lot on you.
So good. No, this is great. And you could, I mean, obviously everyone can sense just the depth that you can speak to this. And I love how you're able to incorporate the emotional intelligence part of this and take it to a deeper level. You know, you and I have had many conversations, and I don't actually think I know some of your personal story about, I guess, navigating your own vertical development. I'm curious, now that I think we've done a good job of setting the stage for the problem and the brain science behind it. I wondered if you'd be comfortable, and of course we don't have to go too deep if you don't want to, but I'd love to know maybe some of how you have applied this, and maybe if you're able to talk about even some of the brain science as you have done that in your own life, of going back and look at your own upbringing and experiences and how that affected the way you showed up and the way you looked at the world.
Yeah, well, I appreciate the invitation to share a little bit about my story, and I'm happy to share, and I hope it's my story, and there's a million ways to vertically develop, and there's no one right way, but I hope maybe by me sharing my story, it will help illuminate the paths of others a little bit. So I first started, I'm going to call it my vertical development journey, about 8 years ago when I started. In fact, to start it is I got fired for my job. I never thought I would be somebody who got fired, and I got fired. It wasn't a great fit, but I also, now I realize I was very self-protective. And I didn't necessarily do anything wrong, but I don't think I was adding the value to my organization that they wanted me to add because of some of my self-protective tendencies. And I didn't realize that at the time, but I think that was the case. And so it set me on a journey to start to learn about mindsets. And I started to learn about mindsets. And so this was about 8 years ago. And I quickly realized, as I'm learning about these different sets of mindsets, that my mindsets are not very good. They're not very positive. And so I was like, okay, I've got to start working on my mindsets. And so I've got, if you read Success Mindsets, or if you take my mindset assessment, you'll know I focus on 4 different sets of mindsets. And what I started to work on each of these sets for myself. And what I found is, over the course of about 4 years, I was able to make real significant improvements in 3 of the 4 mindsets. So I was able to shift from fixed to growth, closed to open, and prevention to promotion. That doesn't mean I was perfect with my mindsets, but I literally transformed my life. And I just remember thinking, after 4 years of doing this, I have grown more in the last 4 years than all of my adult life before that. And I was just thinking, man, this is awesome. Well, I also recognize that there's this other mindset set that I struggled with still. It's this inward to outward mindset. And I knew it was holding me back. And I picked up a book. I don't know if you've read the book or heard about it, Cal. It's called The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk. And It's all about the role that trauma plays in our body. And as I'm reading this book, he's talking about some of these terms, hypervigilance and dissociation. And the dissociation stuff that he talked about, I was like, oh my goodness, I am dissociated. I never realized it. I just thought that how I navigated the world was normal. Like, I've always known that I've been very even keel in terms of my emotions. I don't have big highs or big lows. And that's a sign that I'm dissociated. Come to find out that that's not always the best way to be. In some circumstances, it's not bad. It helps me, but for the most part, it really limits me. And so I recognize this in myself. And at the end of the book, he recommends different trauma therapy modalities. And one of these therapy modalities that he talks about is EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. And he's describing this, and it's about like moving your eyes side to side, or doing tapping side to side, or having buzzers, or even beeps in your ear side to side. And for whatever reason, and science doesn't fully understand it, but for whatever reason, the side to side physical activation reduces our defensive walls and allows us to go back into past traumatic experiences and reprocess those experiences in a healthy way, and ultimately heal ourselves. And so I'm learning about this, and I now know I'm dissociated. And so I reach out to a trauma therapist, and I start working with her doing EMDR therapy, as well as another form of therapy called internal family systems therapy. And I come to realize through this experience, and I just never acknowledged it before, but I came to realize that while I was never physically abused as a child and my parents stayed together, I was emotionally neglected by my parents. And how that showed up for me, now I can now fully realize this, is I could not trust my parents to be there to meet my emotional needs. So what did my body do as a child? Well, what my body did was, because you don't have support to navigate your emotions, I'm going to cut off your emotions altogether. And that is what led me to be dissociated. And so I worked with my trauma therapist for over 2 years to help me heal my body's nervous system. It's now been about 4 years since I started that process. And I can now say I have grown more in the last 4 years than I have all of my adult life before this, including the 4 years prior to doing this. And so what I've kind of learned from this situation is, there are different levels of being side work. There's surface, and we've touched on all of them now. There's surface level strategies, and that's things like meditation, right? Meditation is a surface level strategy. There's deeper level strategies, which are focused on upgrading our mindsets. And then there's deepest level strategies, which are intensely focused on healing ourselves from past trauma or even from some neurodivergencies. So one of the things I've learned is that ADHD, for example, inhibits our altitude along our being side. But there's things that we can do to literally reprogram our brain so that we operate at a higher level. So that's a bit about my journey, but I'm happy to dive into any of that further if you would like to.
Well, Ryan, first of all, thank you for sharing that. And I love that you write about this and that you've lived it. To me, that gives it another level of authority, because you are an academic. You've studied this. I believe wasn't your dissertation on mindsets?
Well, it's on leadership and leadership development. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I appreciate it. I think that gives you another level of not just talking about it and teaching about it, but you live it and you model it. And I really believe in this. I believe that if leaders really want to grow and get to that next level, including, of course, speaking to myself here too, I just love that I think this is where you go. And I think you give us a framework for how to do it. Anything else you want to share, Ryan? You've been so generous with your time. Anything else you want to share on this book with the leaders listening?
Yeah, I think here's a phrase that I've heard that it kind of resonates with me. Not because I smoke marijuana or anything, but I've heard the phrase, "We are never fully baked. We could all spend some more time in the oven." And I think there's so much truth to that. We're never going to be done with our vertical development journey, elevating along our being side. But if we could connect to our being side, it's really the only way for us to become the people that we want to become, the spouse or the partner that we want to become, the parent that we want to become, the leader that we want to become, the employee if we want to become better in any way, it's got to involve an elevation in our being side. And I just feel like there are so many people that want to become better, but don't know how to become better. And I hope that this book is ultimately a tool that will help them to do so.
I just thought about, we spent a lot of time thinking about, how do you succeed at work and succeed at home? And it just hit me as you were saying that this is largely the way. You work on these, developing here, as you mentioned, not only do you become more effective at work and as a leader, but you also become a better husband and a better father, whatever the other roles are that you play. And I've noticed that in my own life. In fact, the people that the wonderful team that I get to work with, as we talk about mindsets and emotional intelligence, one of the things we keep commenting on is, wow, I feel like this is not just helping me here at work, but I feel like I'm a better person at home. And so I love that you're helping us do that. Tell people where to follow you, Ryan, where to connect with your work, and of course, tell them more about how to get the book.
Yeah, I would love to connect with anybody. So my website is ryangottfredson.com. Like I said, there's some free assessments. You can learn information about the book there. If you want to connect on social media, I'm most active on LinkedIn. Would love to connect with you there. And then we're recording this before the book is out. So the book will officially be out the end of June. And then you'll be able to get that wherever you can buy books. But if you wanted a pre-release copy, you might be able to twist my arm. So shoot me an email and we might be able to get you one.
Awesome. Well, Ryan, thanks so much. It's been so fun to reconnect, and I'm really excited about this book.
Yeah, well, I appreciate you creating the space for this. I also respect very much the work that you do, and I think we both recognize that and find ourselves, fortunately, as in the position maybe as teachers and professors of knowing and having the desire to positively influence the lives of others. I mean, the reality is you don't start a podcast to become well known, because that generally doesn't happen with people who start podcasts. You do it because you're creating value for others in the world. And so to be able to partner with people like you that get that and have that same desire to create value. I mean, it's just helps me feel like, not that I feel this way, but we're not alone in this effort, right?
Yeah. Well, thanks, Ryan. I appreciate your time. Well, thank you, my friend, for making it to the end of that episode with Dr. Ryan Gottfredson. He just gave us a masterclass on what it really takes to grow, not just as a leader, but as a human being. Here are a few takeaways. Your being side, your nervous system, your mindset, and emotional regulation is where real transformation happens. Awareness is the first step. Ask yourself, how do I make meaning of challenge, of risk, and feedback? Expand your window of tolerance through practices like meditation, and work on healing your internal operating system, not just building skills. And that's what helps you become the leader, the spouse, the parent, and the person that you're made to be. If this conversation with Ryan resonated with you, I highly recommend you check out his book, Becoming Better. You can also take free assessments at ryangottfredson.com. And if you want to really go deeper, if you want to be in a group of people that's going to stretch you and help you grow and help you see things that you haven't seen, help you challenge those limited beliefs that you're currently operating with, have the encouragement to help you grow towards your greatest dreams and vision, I would encourage you to look at the Intentional Leader Lab. I am going to be devoting myself to this work starting in October. And if you want to join a small group of leaders that are really going to go deep and really grow in a tight community and get to know each other really well, shoot me an email at cal@calwalters.me, or you can click the link below and either book a call with me or just go ahead and apply. I've only got 9 spots left, and based on how quickly we filled up the first 3, I think things are going to move fairly quickly. So I would love to have you in that group as we kick things off in October, and I hope you have a wonderful week this week. Thank you so much for being here. Remember, life is short. Let's go make it count.